The following conversation with Amanda Janoo experienced a few audio issues. However, this is not going to change the incredible content and our talk about the fourth industrial revolution and an economy that works for us. Enjoy. Hey everyone, episode 20. Welcome back to Two Nobodies. We took a little bit of a break, but we're back. And I'm so excited to have our guest today. Her name is Amanda Janoo. I kind of just randomly messaged Amanda, and thankfully she responded back. I really appreciate that. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Kyle can't be here today. He's busy with his two kids and his busy life as a dad. So we'll miss him today, but just happy to have you here, Amanda. So welcome to Two Nobodies. Can't wait for our conversation.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it as well.
So you're from Vermont, the state of Bernie.
Oh, absolutely. Bernie bro for life.
Is he like beloved? Is that a real thing? Like us Canadians are infatuated with American politics, of course. And so we see Bernie and he's just like this, almost like this superhuman kind of figure that we see across the border. Is it the real deal? Like Vermont is in love with Bernie?
Yeah, I mean, he's been our representative forever before he even became a senator. And I think there was this time when there was a guy who came up from Massachusetts and was trying to run for the representative seat. And Vermont's so small, right? So every state gets two senators, but your representatives are based on population. So we only have one representative, so it's actually harder, technically, to get into the House than it is the Senate.
Okay.
And so I guess, political analysts or whatever probably had encouraged this guy to move up to Vermont to try to get a congressional seat. And he ended up spending, I can't even remember, maybe like $25 million or something like this on his campaign. It was like a huge, smear Bernie campaign. And Bernie, I think, ended up spending something like $5,000 on his campaign, and he won by a landslide, right? It probably was more than 5,000, obviously, but very small amounts, just because. Yeah, I mean, I think there is an appreciation and a trust of him, but I mean, people are also critical of certain things as well. But the fact that the United States would have elected him, I believe, to me, it's just such a great sign for the country. I kind of gave up on U.S. politics when they passed Citizen United. I was like, okay, well, we're not even pretending that we're not a privatized government. And then
that was a 20, I think it was like a 2010 decision, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and I was working in international development, and I just sort of decided to just stay and work with countries that I felt like had more of a motivation to meaningfully, support the interests of their people. And then I remember hearing whispers from some friends in Vermont that Bernie was going to run for president. And I was like, what? That would be nuts. So I came back and I volunteered on this campaign a little bit, but I couldn't have even imagined how much support he would end up getting. And that for me was, a big moment for believing in America, I guess, again, because I think we get a pretty bad rep in the media. And our media, but deep inside, I think we've got some radical kindness.
Was that the first time for you that really kind of captivated you in terms of politics? Or were you kind of, I would say from afar for me, the Obama campaign, watching that was very sort of inspiring, and I got caught up in that. Was that this sort of similar for you, or was Bernie sort of really the first time?
Bernie definitely a lot more for me than Obama, actually. I mean, Obama was amazing, right? And especially the campaign. I think his presidency for me was really disappointing, especially with the financial crisis and him coming into the financial crisis and there being a moment to really fundamentally transform our economic and financial systems, and none of that happening at all. So his chief advisors were former Goldman Sachs executives, right? You know what I mean? You're having the problem trying to give you the solution. And so that was really frustrating. And then obviously the Muslim ban and, all of the drone warfare and all of these things, right? They were just a little bit of a bummer. And I just feel like I believe that there's probably a lot that the military industrial complex like plays in terms of US politics that we don't really fully understand. But if there's one person who you would be able to determine how much an individual as a president could really do, it would be Bernie Sanders, right? Like, because he doesn't shift his message. Yeah, like he's
been consistent.
Yeah,
for sure.
He's gonna like push for the exact same things no matter what position he's in. And so it'd be interesting to see what he would be able to accomplish, I guess, as president was the thing that I was really excited about.
I was reading. Well, I'm still reading. The book is massive. Obama's memoir, and he goes into, if you haven't had a chance, he goes into the depths of the financial crisis, and he really spells out why he chose each and every individual to be a part of his team. And then he talks about really like the progressive side of his party and how they were saying the exact same things that essentially you're saying, right? Like they're frustrated with like the people who were selected, that why he's not turning Wall Street on its head, all these kind of things. And he spells out at least what was going through his mind in terms of the decision making. I found it fascinating, whether folks agree with that or not. Like that's
what was
totally
the rationale?
Oh goodness, you're going to catch me here on the spot. So I think part of it was that because it needed some major structural changes, it was hard to find the people who really understood the system. And then in order to actually, personally, when I saw that crisis, and I was so surprised that not one person, like none of those CEOs were in jail. Right. I mean, like, it's just a horrendous thing that happened in the 2008 financial crisis, like people losing their entire retirement. It's just pathetic and sad, right? Frankly. And so I was always frustrated with like why no one lost their jobs or no one like went to jail and all this stuff. And it bothered him so much. But in order to get people to lead these companies going forward, because I guess they needed some of the major banks in place in order to sort of keep the financial system afloat, they needed people who really understood the system. So it's one of those things where it's like, if you're on the inside, you can kind of really control the situation because nobody understands what the heck you're doing outside of that system.
I mean, they don't understand what they're doing either, though. Yeah, like the financial transactions are far beyond like the human mind's capacity to even possibly, comprehend. They're like going at such a speed. But it is interesting, I mean, especially compared to Iceland, for example, who had by far a much worse like financial collapse. Like they were ostensibly just a giant hedge fund as a country. They had their economy collapse overnight. And instead of saying, oh, too big to fail, I mean, the government put bankers in jail. Yeah, they protected like the domestic sort of savings, and they allowed for that entire sector to fall. And they rebuilt on the basis of much more diversified and much more people-led sort of recovery efforts. So it's a choice, right?
For sure. And the thing is that I don't know, I think to his credit, he acknowledges that it was his choice. Like he's like, I wasn't comfortable to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Like I wasn't comfortable to make the decision of flipping it entirely because of XYZ reasons. And he spells that out. And I'm not going to remember those reasons, so I'm going to butcher that. But it was worth from just like in terms of studying how someone's decision making. And I felt like, you take it for what it's worth if it's honest or not, but he's pretty detailed about it. So I mean, anyways, I thought it was a good sort of reflection. Again, whether people agree with that or not, that's.
I really love autobiographies for that reason, like really understanding people. Because I read Bill Clinton's My Life a long time ago, and his rationale equally for neoliberalism and NAFTA and like the all of these things. It's the incredibly intelligent people, right? Who have their reasons for doing the things they do. It just ends up screwing most people over.
Yeah, so what a really tough job, right? I mean, like the questions that come to their desks, right? Like there's no black or white answer. It's the problems that nobody has a good answer. Like if it was easy, it would have been solved already, right? It's just an immense challenge, and especially like I'm assuming in the United States, especially most people look towards the president, even though the president doesn't have a lot of power in a congressional system, right? Whereas in Canada, for instance, the Prime Minister of Canada has an immense amount of power, especially in a majority government. So it's just interesting to sort of see how Americans view the presidential system and how much faith and belief they have in that leader, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're usually pretty divided, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As is everywhere, I feel like these days, but yeah. But you know what, that kind of that actually prompted sort of our thinking and talking about the fourth industrial revolution. And that's really, you know, one of the main reasons why we wanted to have the conversation, although I'm really enjoying this conversation about politics. But the main reason was that we were starting to see these big disruptors that are happening in the economy from a technological standpoint. And we started thinking about, okay, this is really going to shift the economy. We started researching that people are identifying a potential fourth industrial revolution, that it's already happening or that we're on the verge of. And like, what does that do, right? Like, what is that going to do for people? Like, that was our concern, right? Especially as we not only position our lives and our careers and thinking about how we move forward, but also for our kids. A lot of our conversations that Kyle and I have are about fatherhood and parenting and thinking about sort of how our kids are going to develop and all those sort of things. So that was sort of a major piece for the fourth industrial revolution is how is this economy going to pivot? Is there an opportunity to pivot in a different direction? Have the systems in the past, are they so ingrained that you can't actually make major shifts? But it doesn't seem that way from our initial research, is that these major disruptors in our economy have the potential to really, you know, create some opportunities for the better. And so then when I was looking at people and organizations that were looking into this, into you know, how we can make an economy that benefits everyone, or benefits, you know, the people, or makes the economy work for everyone, essentially. The organization that you work for, WEAll, kind of came up. Do you want to talk about WEAll and sort of the work that you guys do?
Sure. Yeah. So WEAll is the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and it's an organization that's not too old. Actually, it only began maybe 2.5 years ago. But the idea is it's an alliance of organizations, governments, academics, activists, citizens, and generally just change makers who are all committed to transforming our economic system. And so it started with a realization that there's so many different movements that are either dealing with symptoms of the economic system, like climate change or mental health or inequality issues, you know,
right,
or are advocating for fundamental shifts in our economy, like circular economy, donut economics, you know, B Corp, a lot of different sort of movements therein, and realizing that transforming something as big as the economic system requires us to come together, right? To build a power base and to recognize that there's power in numbers. And so WEAll emerged as an umbrella by which to house all of these different movements and organizations, and to illustrate their interconnection and the fact that they might come under different banners, but at the heart is a realization that like people and planet are not here to serve the economy. Yeah, like the economy is here to serve us, and we have the power and we have the capacity to mold it and direct it according to our values, right? And to make it work in service of people and planet. And so that for us is a lot of what we work on, is amplifying the work of our members, trying to shift public perceptions around the economy. So for me personally, and I don't know how it is for you in Canada, but in the US, the term economy holds this crazy power, right? Like you say, oh, this is going to be bad for the economy, then it's immediately illegitimate. Or you say it's going to be good for the economy, then all right, let's go. But it's also something where you're constantly told it's too complicated for you to have an actual say over, right? That it's something best left to experts. So it's not both the most important thing and also the thing you're not allowed to actually have an influence over. And so like that in of itself is like quite a paradox, and something that I think we need to overcome and demystify and recognize that we are the economy. Yeah, like that's what we're talking about. We're just talking about us. Like we're talking about the way we produce and provide for one another. And we can do that in a lot of different ways. And we have done that in a lot of different ways. And we can do it in a way that regenerates our natural environment and is just and fair, right? Like that's an option.
Totally.
We just need to make that choice. And so, yeah, that's a lot of...
What a simple concept that the economy should be working for us rather than us working for the economy. I love that. What went wrong? Like, how did this sort of change? And actually before that though, I think, because I know in our sort of email exchanges, you said that you had a little bit of a background in this. Maybe, I think people would benefit to hear a little bit about your story and sort of how you kind of arrived at this point.
Sure. Yeah. I do. And I appreciate it. I'd love to hear your story also and what made you want to start this podcast. I don't know if you've already gone through that with previous episodes, but yeah, so I grew up in a small rural town in Vermont. We had like one paved road and a general store. Yeah, we're too small to really have a government, so we have town meetings. So in March, the town comes together and they debate and decide on how much money is going to go to the roads or the schools or things like this. So that for me was kind of my introduction to politics and economics, right? So you can imagine my horror when I went into university and people were trying to explain to me economics, and I was like, what is this garbage? I was like, what are they even talking about? Because I mean, even from the beginning, the assumption that we're all inherently like rational, selfish, competitive individuals, like that doesn't resonate with my understanding of people, or my own self-identity. And that's like really foundational to the entire discipline. And there's a lot of other obvious assumptions. And so I got really interested in history of economic thought, like understanding where these ideas came from, their historical context. Really passionate about the issues with neoliberalism. So like this spread of this idea that the government should take a hands-off approach to the economy and it should just go off on its own, that there shouldn't be any sort of guidance or values, like somehow like put upon it. And so I went into the world and not really knowing how one combats something like neoliberalism. I got really into industrial policy. Actually, I worked for the UN for a long time as an industrial policy expert, because industrial policy is kind of like old school development theory. So it's where the government takes a really active role in protecting or promoting certain sectors or economic activities or businesses, because they think, and traditionally it's been manufacturing. So that's why it's called industrial policy, because you try to make more of your own stuff, right? Like transform your raw materials and your things into something new to add more value to it. And so I spent a long time working with governments to try to design industrial policies, like strategic interventions, but always very cognizant that the countries I was working with didn't have a lot of space, honestly, for that kind of meaningful intervention, because the power of a lot of multinational corporations and the global economic system and all of these things made it very difficult for them. So for me, coming to WEAll has just been a dream job. Like I cannot explain to you how much I enjoy this job. I just get to nerd out about the economic system all the time and just speak about radical visions and alternatives, and people love it, right? It's not just like, oh, wow, like that's naive. You should.
Well, the funny thing is that when you say this, there's like a genuine expression of like love for your job. It's not just like just a shameless
promo. Like I could see that this really like
this is the job and this is the kind of work that you want to do. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, no, I feel really lucky. Definitely. I mean, but it was a long road, to get there, and a lot of different experiences, and I'm grateful for all of them. But yeah, psyched to be able to talk about like this with you here,
Is I would think that the those who study industrial policy and are industrial policy experts, I would think in maybe North America, this is an assumption that that's sort of maybe a dying breed, just because of, if you're saying a lot of it is based in manufacturing, that a lot of manufacturing is sort of shifted elsewhere. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah. I mean, within the United States itself, actually, a lot of our industrial policy happens within the military. So a lot of, because traditionally it's where the government's putting in money into research and development, R&D,
Right.
like technological innovations, like all of these sort of things. That often for us happens in that black box of 60% of our government spending that we're not really sure what's going on. But then comes the internet, yeah, then comes whatever stuff, right? And so we do it a lot. And we do it still as well with a lot of subsidies for agricultural farmers, for example.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, the corporations, we give a lot of tax exemptions to the biggest corporations and a lot of incentives to them. So it exists, right? It's just maybe not in its most traditional form.
It's amazing how much of a catalyst military R&D has been in terms of all these technological advancements, hey? A lot of the things that we sort of use on a day-to-day seems to have come from just all that money that was put in like the 60s and 70s and into the military. It seems that way. I don't know for sure, but
yeah. And I mean, I think around the world, honestly, I think we underestimate the amount that government expenditure has been the source of the things that we most appreciate in our lives. So there is a lot of really wonderful innovations that happen at the community or in the business, like sort of sectors, but a lot of it comes from very concerted and purposeful investment by the state in these kinds.
Well, I was reading even with the COVID vaccine that if government didn't invest, all the money that they did, it definitely de-risked these companies, these pharmaceutical companies, to pursue these vaccines because it just wasn't as profitable. So yeah, it's probably that's a really good point. I was thinking about you were talking about you're from rural Vermont. It's funny because I just read a story about apparently this folklore hero, and I can't remember his name, and it's bothering me right now.
Ethan Allen?
No. This was so when I say folklore, I don't know if that means real. So sometimes I say words and I don't really know if they actually make sense. So I apologize for that. But it was this person that apparently had he lived in rural Vermont and he had this parcel of land, and the state wanted to put a freeway or interstate through that part of land, and he was so furious with this, and he decided to light himself and his property on fire. Do you know about this?
I do not know about this.
Yeah, this is.
Oh my goodness! I just read this article. Like, it's so funny because I did not do this research. It just popped up in one of my feeds. I don't know if I was what that was about, but yeah. So he apparently locked himself in his farmhouse or wherever he lived and set himself on fire because it was the day before that they were just going to take his property away, and it was really, really sad, and everybody just sort of remembers, I guess, this man and what he did. And so more recently, I guess there's a tree that's sort of the last sort of remaining artifact of his time in this property, but this tree is right near this parking lot that's like a park and go, I guess, off the interstate or the freeway. And that tree apparently is kind of becoming a hazard to cars parked near in that parking lot. And so there was this huge sort of conversation with the community and the town about whether they should cut down this tree. They had a full engagement. And then at the end, they said that there was going to be this sort of memorial for this person where the tree was to sort of honor his legacy. And I was just like, okay.
So that's what it's like to live in rural Vermont, I guess.
I just really love it. It's just so sad.
I'll have to send you that article sort of off after we're done recording because I think I read it in the New York Times, and it was definitely worth it. It was one of my morning reads, and I was just I was like had every emotion as I was reading that.
I know, it makes me feel a lot of emotions too, definitely. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, rural.
No, that's okay. There's times where we're talking and our kids are yelling upstairs or whatever, so it's par for the course. But what was I going to say now? I was gonna say, it's just rural life to me is always fascinating. I grew up in Toronto, which is a huge, obviously, urban environment. Now live in Edmonton, which is still a big city, relatively. I guess in Canada we have not the biggest population, but relatively, anyways, it's a big city. And so my wife, she's from a small town in Ontario, and she just tells me about sort of how life was there, but just even more at a rural level. I find it interesting. I find just like the way you describe sort of how decisions are made and how people are just engaged on everything. It really reaffirms that politics is local, right? And to your point, the economy is really should be about people and should be at a local level. So I think that's really
well. I think it helps when you have real transactions and interactions with people, right? Because I mean, that's really when the economy becomes like a real thing, right? It's when we're making something together and we're exchanging something between us, and I'm giving you something, right? Like that's what this whole system is. It's just we're increasingly removed from one another in those transactions, so we don't see how much of ourselves we're giving to others all of the time in what we do, and so it can feel alienating or far away, but it is. I mean, it's a beautifully intricate system. It just, and a lot of cooperation. Like, we talk a lot about competition, but there's an insane amount of coordination and cooperation that's involved in that, right? And trust that's involved in it.
Yep.
But I don't know. I mean, it is the rural urban thing is interesting with COVID because there's a whole reverse migration happening right now. I don't know if you're experiencing that. Have a lot of people
where people are trying to escape the urban environment so that they could, maybe get some R&R or something like that.
Are you experiencing that a lot?
Yeah, there are parts of Alberta, like, because we the west part of Alberta kind of borders the Rockies, and so just beautiful towns along the Rockies, and so they've had to actually close down access to these towns because of people traveling in from Calgary and Edmonton into these small towns that just can't handle that extra population. So is that sort of what you're speaking to? Well, they've closed access, or they've had restrictions in terms of accessing those towns just because of they just can't handle those that kind of volume right now. So
I mean, we've had a huge flood of people coming and moving to Vermont. Apparently this happened after 9/11 as well. I think in times of crisis, people are like, Vermont, that's where I can weather the apocalypse. Like everything's gonna be okay there, and it's good. I mean, we need more young people and stuff, so it's fine. It's good, especially if it's not COVID homes, like people with their like second or third or fourth home. Like if you're coming to like hang out, I think it's really it's a really good thing. But it's an interesting shift, right? Because everything was focused on us all moving towards these very concentrated mega cities, and that was what all of the trajectory looked like. And then just this past year, that's shifted a lot because there's been a lot more remote work as well, right? So again, with like the technological revolution and the opportunities to be able to connect in a way that doesn't require to be in the same physical space with one another. And I think people living in rural areas, I'm biased obviously, but it's really important. Like I remember, I don't know how many years ago it was, maybe like 7 years ago, reading a news article that said for the first time ever, the majority of humanity now lived in cities as opposed to in rural communities. And I thought about the stars, and about all the majority of people living in these big cities and not being able to see the stars, and how much the stars have been the foundation of so much of our spiritual and scientific development, and like not having the capacity to see that and to have that moment of like ego loss, right? And like I'm just like, I am this thing relative to that thing, and to be connected enough to nature to notice climate change, to not know it in an abstract way, but to see the environment changing, like all of these things I think are really positive if people are in areas where they can be more connected to nature.
I love that. And also when you talk about connecting to nature, I was thinking the same thing. I don't know if there's stats on this, but I suspect that there are many people who are just feeling like they need to be more connected and are embracing that sort of more isolated lifestyle, or taking on sort of a little bit more agriculture, and just shifting their way of life, and just wanting to sort of slow down and focus on what really, really matters. Because you're absolutely right. When you get caught in a city, like nothing else. We always say most people in Canada make fun of the fact that when someone's from Toronto, they say you're the center of the universe or the center of the world, sort of thing, right? Like that's Canadian perspective and context just for you. But it's funny because I came from Southern Ontario, and I would say that when I moved out to Alberta, which is quite a ways far west, you really realize how big and awesome the country is, and how there's so much more in terms of the Canadian people, but just geographically, like you really do get trapped in that kind of city bubble, and it wears on you. So it is interesting that you say that. My wife has this sort of dream of like wanting to live like kind of in this isolated place with a tiny home and all that stuff. And I don't blame her, because, sometimes things are it's just too much, right? You're inundated with all kinds of crap, frankly, right? So.
Did you know also that dirt is an antidepressant?
Dirt is?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're talking about like really good dirt, like that's rich and organic. Does
just
that
like
matter?
Any dirt, yeah. Like
okay.
Yeah, like it interacts with our, like neurochemicals in a way that is like, boosts our like dopamine levels and stuff.
That's funny because I just hauled 7 cubic yards of dirt in my yard the other day.
So, are you feeling so happy?
I have to reflect and
feel less depressed, and that will be
scientific proof, because 7 cubic yards was a lot of dirt. I want to go back to sort of when the economy hasn't been working for us, but we've been working for the economy. When, in your view, when did that sort of shifts happen? Like, did that start to happen sort of after the first industrial revolution? Like, walk me through that thinking in terms of when things started to not go the way it should have been going.
Yeah. So the industrial revolution for me is the most fascinating period of history. It was definitely when so many like socio-political economic transformations happened for the West. But also it was the emergence of what we will now understand to be economics. And so, so you had the Industrial Revolution that was happening around like the turn of the like 17th, 18th century, right? And along with that came unprecedented amounts of wealth generation. So Adam Smith, right, who is often heralded as the father of economics, was like, wow, like, where's all this wealth coming from, right? Like, what is the source of this beautiful opulence and, money that we've never seen before? And so he looked into this system and said, okay, this method by which we are taking from the earth and transforming it into something new. We've developed new systems like producing things at scale and divisions of labor and all of this stuff. But importantly, his major point was this system is being driven, right, by not our benevolence, but by our own self-interest, right? And that everybody working on the basis of their own self-interest will magically actually serve the good of the whole. And that was by people, producing and competing and whatever. And so the time period was relevant, right? Because you're talking about you're moving from like a mercantilist era where kings and monarchs and things were like controlling a lot of the way that people's lives were happening and the way that things were traded and all of this stuff. So there was the liberalist sort of movement and allow us the freedom, right? Like to live our own lives. You also had really strong Judeo-Christian assumptions around original sin. Yeah. So the fact that like one thing you can count on is that people are kind of shit. Yeah. So like that was sort of underpinning it. And then you also had this like whole sort of philosophical exploration into human nature and like Hobbes and Locke and the purpose of government, like relative to civil society. And so all of that laid the foundations for a very particular emergence of economics, which previously there had been discussions of economics, but economics was understood to be either, like the household, the way that people provided for one another. It was understood to be, like a means towards the improvement of our quality of life. Like that was very Aristotle kind of, and then this now became the economics is about understanding wealth generation, right? And so how we transform the earth and utilize people in the interest of generating wealth, right? And so that as even a framing sets the stage very much for people and planet kind of being like just little cogs, right, into a system of wealth generation. And so, and you also then had at that time, this is kind of nerdy. I don't know if this is getting too nerdy for you. Yeah,
this is great. This is exactly what I wanted.
Yeah, but there was then came like John Stuart Mill and the utilitarianism, like, and Bentham, who were fundamentally interested in happiness, right? Like what matters for happiness, but didn't really feel like they could measure happiness. So proxy.
What time was that about, would you say?
That's like Bentham was probably like early 1800s, you know what I mean? Like mid 1800s with like Mill and stuff like that.
So we're still in that, like when they section out the first and the second revolution, we're still, if my understanding is, we're still kind of in that first period.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and they, the idea that maybe we don't know what makes people happy, but we know how much wealth, like let's assume that wealth makes people happy, right? And
it's an indicator of happiness.
Yeah, because it really does, right? Like up to the point that it ensures that we feel secure in our basic comforts, more money makes a huge difference. Yeah, it makes a massive difference to our happiness. It's just that once we have security in our basic comforts, more money doesn't make us any happier. Yeah, so like but they couldn't have foreseen, right? Because they're living in a time when there was a lot more physical sort of and real material deprivation than there is now. And so like all of that is kind of like a rosier picture of like how the economy works and what the point is. And then obviously you had Marx who came along and was like, okay, right. But it's sort of like, I had a professor once who described this my favorite way. It's like, imagine that Adam Smith is like Steven Spielberg, like talking about the economy, then Karl Marx is like Tim Burton, about the same movie, where he's just like, okay, well, actually, let me explain to you how you're making all this wealth, and it is by exploiting people, like you're just not giving them their fair due. And so then it became a bit of like a real social issue, right? Like a rights issue, because it was an ethical issue of if you and I do something together, we're going to be able to do more than either two of us alone, right? And so the question is, how do we share the outcome of that? Yeah, and so the point is that if you are the owner of capital in Marx's perspective, right, then you deserve to have more. But if we're both putting in the same time and effort, like, is that fair? Yeah, you know what I mean? And so, like, this is where, like, ethics come in and all of these things. And so then in the, like, turn of the century in the 1900s, going into, like, the 30s, 40s, they had, it was still always political economy. It was, like, a philosophy. And then it really became economics when they were like, hey, actually, don't worry about this because the economy is not even about the production side. It's actually about the consumer side. Yeah. So like value is not determined by our effort and our ingenuity and like how we produce things. It's determined by how much people are willing to pay for it. So all of a sudden, all of those ethical concerns around production, like just forget about it, right? Like let's just focus on the consumers. And then you had all of the like general equilibrium models, and then economics became a mathematical sort of science. And then that just sort of like since then has been this abstract sort of sphere that people feel like they can't touch because it's jargony and it's mathematical. But it was the foundations for then, you know, what I was talking about like earlier with like neoliberalism and a certain sort of ideology for the rightful role of the state relative to the market. And I think that also had a lot to do with trying to maintain neocolonial sort of trading patterns too, you know, of keeping developing countries producing like raw materials that we would then produce in some way and then go. But now, now the production has become, I feel like I'm probably going too fast right now. I just realized I just skipped like a bunch of steps in terms of the logic. Let me stop for a second and see if you have any thoughts or
reflections. What I was gonna say is, so you identified some key moments that really drove some of the progress and how things move. But I'm kind of wondering, what role did technological development play in creating these shifts, right? Because like we talked about at the beginning with the fourth industrial revolution, my understanding is that a lot of the technology advancements that are really going to disrupt the economy and really creating the revolution that we're talking about today. Was that sort of the same thing early on, or was it because of these people and sort of how people are starting to view the economy, which was really the basis for that revolution and that shift? I'm just trying to understand, I guess, like, is it both of them? They're kind of intertwined and working together, or was one sort of really a little bit more dominant?
I mean, I think probably that's very much relative to your perspective, but absolutely. I mean, first of all, technology, we often think of it as a machine, like as a physical thing, but in reality, it's just a process, right? So we've had technology forever in the sense of it's the process by which we do things, right? And so that can be a physical act, a tradition of certain methods of agricultural production, for example, or, inherited wisdom around, different types of medical remedies, whatever, right? Like that's all technology as well. But it's once it comes in the form of like a reified thing, right? Like a thing like which in the case of the first industrial revolution, like, with steam engines and with, the cotton gin and with these sort of things that were like really profound in terms of like efficiency and productivity and output and how much you could produce in a period of time. It did. I mean, it had huge transformations for society. Like society transformed overnight. I mean, you ended up having even people didn't used to sleep the way we sleep now. Yeah. Like people used to sleep like babies sleep. Yeah. Like in little sections throughout the day. And then like with the Industrial Revolution became this idea that it's like you stay up all day and you like, you know what I mean? Like sleep like these sort of periods.
I didn't know that actually.
Yeah. And then
No, I was just saying that people slept the way they did, and that there was a huge shift as a result of this sort of revolution.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, also then you had massive like rural urban migration that was happening. You had huge like sweatshops, child labor, huge industrial pollution, all of these things, and so that's why I mean, some people were like, "Oh, this is amazing," and those were the people because the theorists at the time all came from really wealthy backgrounds, right? You know what I mean? So they're like, this is great. Like, everything's so good. And then you also had movements like the Luddites, right? Like people who were physically going to destroy machinery because they were like, you were destroying our world, right? And so I think you always end up having these sort of counterbalance movements of seeing the disruptions that are happening from the world and the way we live. I mean, I can imagine for you, especially as a father, for example, like social media, yeah, the amount that has transformed our lives, the amount that it is influencing children, right? Like,
for sure.
Yeah, like, it's a good thing. What do you think?
Depends, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely something that, I mean, who knows what it's going to look like, right? Like Kyle and I jokingly talk about on this podcast how our social media presence is terrible. Like we don't have, none of us, when we started this thing, Kyle was like, do you have a Facebook account? And we're like, no. Do you have an Instagram account? No. I have a Twitter account. Okay, let's go with that. Both of us are just not connected because we just find many times it's just a disingenuous way of really building relationships. There's purpose obviously for them, but then there's so many things that come out. Like this year was the year of TikTok. I don't know what that TikTok is, and so who knows what's going to happen.
I just downloaded it. It is very fun, actually.
Is it? I've heard really good things.
I don't know. I don't really fully understand how to use it, but
so you haven't posted anything. Like you're not.
I don't know how to
there
use
a lot. I
it
don't know.
yet, but it's something that I've been grappling a lot with, honestly, where, especially in this new role that I have, I feel like I should be more engaged in social media because it is an incredible tool by which to communicate with an audience you wouldn't otherwise communicate with, right?
For
like
sure.
to get out of your echo chamber, yeah, like your particular bubble, and to like reach other people with a particular message you might have, for example, about the economy. Yeah, like its possibility for transformation. And I have in like my solar plexus like this resistance to it, and I don't know if it's from fear of like really putting myself out there, or if it's just legitimate recognition of how toxic a space it is, right? Because especially for like women, yeah, and
For sure,
women of color, like it can be a very hateful place, right? And it's not that I don't think that I can deal with that, but it's also, yeah, I prefer to have a conversation than just like to yell into the ether and see what I get back. Yeah, but that might be what I need to do, right? And so it was one of my comms colleagues suggested maybe TikTok could be a good way. I can make little like educational videos about the economy.
I know someone who she's just infatuated, and she like has learned so much in terms of just cooking. And I'm sure there's like social media has done some incredible things as well. I guess it just depends on the way what you're going for and how you use it. But to go back to your question in terms of social media in the context of like my daughter who's only 3, who knows what it's going to look like in 5 years? And it's scary to think that she could be on social media in 5, 6 years, but that's just a reality for a lot of kids. And what role will we play in terms of controlling that for her? And it's a fascinating thing to think about. It is incredibly scary. And yeah, I have no idea. I don't have an answer for you. I think just embodying her with incredible values, and just hopefully trusting her that she can make some good judgment calls in the future. But I don't know what the platforms are going to look like. It's probably only going to be easier. I think the other thing that I personally have when you talk about a feeling in your solar plexus is just how that data is handled, right? I think we all have seen the social dilemma, and hear about, we just don't know what these companies are doing with your data, and that to me is a major point of concern for me. So
Absolutely, 100%. And I mean, it is like the big data industry in and of itself is something which we need to probably get on pretty fast. Like Europe's doing a better job with it because they have some regulations in place to protect some of this privacy, but a lot of countries around the world don't even have the legal infrastructure to be able to try to protect themselves from this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there's a huge risk to a lot of, especially the most vulnerable countries in the world, in terms of the data and information and all of these things like sort of being misused. And it's interesting. I mean, I think there's been a cultural shift also though, where we don't. Actually, it's a question because at the beginning of this, you said a lot of people are really private nowadays, right? And this is interesting because I feel like people don't seem as worried as I would think they would be about these things, or I think they would have been in the past, right? You just sort of accept it as, okay, yeah, they have all my information now, right? Like they're gonna do what they're gonna do with it. But yeah, I don't know. Do you think people are becoming like more private as a result of this?
Well, it's hard to know. I mean,
those people who are really private probably, I suspect, don't have a really strong social media presence. But there's also this, people want to be heard and validated. Everyone wants that to some degree, and especially I think we're living in a more fragile society. And I'll be honest, I'll share, like, we created an Instagram account for this podcast, right? And I'll post, and whenever there's like a like, it's like, oh, there's a like,
right? And I get
caught up in that. And I'm telling myself, like, it's bullshit, right? Like it's great that someone likes your post, right? But like, it's like to be in such a fragile mental state where your happiness is dependent on someone liking a post, like that's a little ridiculous, right? But we've kind of come to that point. So it's don't know. It's just it's a worrisome thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it is designed that way, right? Like to like trigger that sort of reaction, a bit like like a Pavlovian dog or whatever is that what it's called? Yeah, you're like, ding. Yeah. But I also think that we are very social creatures, and we need, right, like a certain amount of.
But don't you think the level of socialization is just not? It's not as meaningful. It doesn't feel as rich. I mean, I'm generalizing here. There's so many ways now people are, especially with COVID. It's just been unbelievable that people are just having these, posting these live conversations on Instagram or through social media, and then people can kind of tune in, and so people have found ways to maintain some level of socialization compared to relative to what it was prior to. So that part's incredible, but generally, like, it just seems that the level of engagement and the meaningfulness from these conversations, it just seems very surface or superficial. Like, and I personally maybe have a hard time with that. And so that's why I have a hard time sort of posting and engaging on social media. So yeah, for me, I think it's like, if I were to be on social media, I'd want to make sure that engagement is really authentic.
Absolutely. And I mean, I do think that people are more drawn to authentic, right? Like communication that some people are able to do online. But I feel you in the sense that I'm a little concerned. So I've been abroad, first of all, let me say this, for about like 12 years. So coming back to the States, I was back for a little bit, like a couple years ago, but I'm a little worried with how much our conversations being mediated through, the majority of our conversations being mediated through social media has made us very ungracious communicators, in the sense that we are not very sympathetic or even interested in intent. Yeah? So like, we don't even really care what somebody might be trying to say. Like, we are all, it's very much about a deconstruction of language. Yeah, and if you're using certain words or not, or things like that. And so we are reading with the intention of finding something that somebody's saying wrong, right? Like, as opposed to really trying to understand what somebody's trying to say and engaging with them. And it's unique to, I think, the written form, first of all, right? I think with videos, you don't have as much, or podcasts, for example, because you can hear like intonation and things like that. But yeah, I think we need a little more understanding right now. Yeah, like of one another, like especially right now, like everybody's struggling so hard all over the world. Yeah, it's just so shit. It's just really shit. So for me, like like having a little patience with other people.
Yeah, and to add to that, like just an appreciation for the work that is put out there, right? Like, I was talking to a colleague. This is just anecdotal, but it just seems like, even with music production, right? Like, do you remember like when you'd be anticipating when your favorite artist was going to drop their CD or their latest album or whatever? You'd be anticipating that. Now, like, something comes out on iTunes or whatever, and you listen to it, and then you're on and you're like thinking, what's the next thing, right? Like, there just seems to be, there's so much stuff that we're being hit with, and so much media, that we're not appreciating and taking the time to slow down the amount of effort and work that people are putting into something. And you know, it's supposed to be, someone's appreciation is supposed to be captured by the heart symbol or a thumbs up, right? It's
really interesting. So let's get us back to the point around technology, right? So
right, thank you.
I should be the one who's facilitating this, so thank you.
No, so the whole thing is that technological innovation, right? The major orientation of it to date has been to increase productivity, right? To like reduce the amount of labor or material input that is required to produce something else. And so that, with that in mind, most people, especially like economists in the 60s and 70s, saw, I guess we would call it around like the third industrial revolution, right? Saw like massive increases in productivity, and assumed that what would happen we would be at a 15-day work week now. We would have a lot more time. Yeah. So with productivity and not needing to work so much, we wouldn't work so much. And it's been the opposite.
Happened.
Yeah, it's been the opposite. Like the most productive countries in the world, people are working the longest hours. Yeah. And so this is where like the flaw in the system is, right? Because we are not there. Like they say in economics, there's like a time wealth trade-off, right? But in reality, we've become, and our pattern and our sort of forced into being consumer addicts and work addicts, right? And wealth addicts. And so it's just like, just keep more. Yeah. Like just more.
Right.
Yeah. And it's, there is a real paradox of choice that is coming from all of the options that we have. There's real time poverty. Like time poverty has the same impact on our mind and our bodies as like food starvation. Yeah, like
sorry, when you say time poverty, just so
well, just like when you are, if you don't have any time to do whatever you want, yeah, like if you are constantly working or like have a lot of like family obligations or whatever it is, right? Like you're time poor, yeah, like it has the same impact on you as like being like food starved. Yeah, like it's that sort of deprivation. Like we really, really need time. And we don't have we have built a society which is so fixated on like growth and more and bigger and get it, right? That we have a very hard time giving ourselves what we need actually, which is connection and generosity and contentment and notions of enough, right? Like how much is enough? We don't have any conception of enough, right? Like it can never be enough. Like that would be to be lazy, right? To be like, oh, cool, I'm good now. Yeah, like that's not even a part of our cultural narrative. And like that, it's all intertwined with this economic system, right? And the coming back to your point around like where did we become slaves to this, right? As opposed to viewing it as in service of us. Because we have more than enough wealth. Yeah, I mean, we're at a point now where globally there's something around, if you divided global wealth across every individual living in the world right now, every person would have about $70,000 of wealth.
Is that right?
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, we're talking about like 8 billion people, right? Like, I mean, there is a shit ton of money in the world, right? Like we are not lacking in wealth or in clothes or in your food or in whatever, right? Like there isn't scarcity actually, but we keep producing more and keep doing more because we're just like, yeah, like let's just keep going. Yeah, like, let's keep doing it. And I do think that COVID is interesting for that. Like I think we're in it, so I don't know how much we'll be able to fully know what the long-term impacts on it will be, but it has forced a pause in some ways for a lot of people, not all people, right, in the world, but it has forced somewhat of a pause, and it has also forced a re-examination of what is really essential, and it is not hedge fund managers, yeah, and billionaires, yeah, and like you know, like the people who are really making out right now. And I think that will be really interesting to see how that plays out with recognizing like nurses and teachers and farmers and, you know, like the really essential parts of our economy, because we can value them. We can make them the most successful jobs and industries in like our societies. Like that's just a choice. We just currently provide a lot more incentives to large investors and companies that are really efficient at generating wealth. Not so much the industries that are efficient at generating well-being.
In the work that WEAll does, have you heard amongst your alliance partners about folks wanting to measure this more effectively? Like, so, you know, the happiness index, right? Like something like that, or a well-being index. My former alma mater, the University of Waterloo, I think they've developed like some sort of index of well-being. Like, do you think that would really help and potentially shift policymakers to really think about the economy differently, but also not only policymakers, but obviously just the broader, you know, public, to just really understand that it's not just the economy, but there's a whole host of factors that contribute to our happiness.
For sure. I mean, it's already happening. So one of the things that WEAll helped instigate was WEGO, which is the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. And this is an alliance or a partnership of governments which include right now New Zealand, Iceland, Scotland, Wales, and Finland. And all of them have developed alternative measurements for progress. So to try to move beyond GDP, so gross domestic product just tells you how much you're producing and consuming. Yeah, it doesn't really tell you anything else about your society's level of well-being, right? So there's a lot of things that are sort of missing. But the assumption being that, that we need to move beyond using purely economic measurements as our barometer of success as a society. And so there are a lot of movements and across a lot of societies. The challenge, of course, is that when you move beyond something really simple, like how much money something creates, to what matters for well-being, there's a lot of factors, right? There's environmental and social and personal and familial. There's values. There's
democratic engagement.
Exactly. Civic engagement, transparency, all of these things. And so that's the reality of the world, right? Like we shouldn't shy away just because it's complex, but it also means that making choices on the basis of much more multidimensional measurements and like frameworks for progress is more challenging, right? And so I think we are in the midst of this shift. I don't think it's a coincidence that most of the WEGO leaders are women. So I do think that as we're seeing more female leadership emerging in the world and less traditional voices entering into some of these spaces, we are also experiencing an expansion of our thinking, right? And a new renaissance in our thinking. So alongside maybe the fourth industrial revolution, where same way that we view the economy as sort of this abstract force that is just happening out there, we tend to view technology that way as well, that it's its own self-evolving, force that is, not somehow a product of the human mind, right? And it is. It's always a product of the human mind. And so therefore, it should be beholden to the same kind of ethical reviews, right? That any human action should be. And so I personally think that, we have philosophers who do reviews of innovations or proposed research in the medical field. We should have the same one for the technological field, right? Because it has huge implications for our society, and I think we should think about it a little bit, right? Like, what is this technological innovation going to bring to society, right? And who is ultimately controlling that innovation? Because one of the things that I will rant a little bit about to you is intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights are some bullshit, okay? Because they really came about purely as a way to limit the capacity of developing countries. When you have firms coming into their country, like setting up shop in their country and producing things, for their capacity to actually produce them themselves ever. And so you're limiting the flow of information and ideas and processes and innovation in order to maintain a consolidation of power and wealth in the hands of certain people, right?
So just to on that one, and I don't know enough about this, and I could be misunderstanding this. My understanding is that intellectual property rights are protected because companies feel that if they weren't, it gives them no incentive to really do additional research, right? Because if it's already out there, then why would they invest more in R&D if their rights aren't protected?
Right. Well, then why would you even produce anything in the first place? You might be outcompeted eventually, right? But that argument doesn't even really make sense, right? Like, of course, it's going to protect people who are able, but I don't think that you should be able to own ideas. Ideas are not things that should be owned. They should be things that are free. They are a product of the collective subconscious. They are a product of, a human society, and they're the things that drive our innovations. And so holding that, right? And saying that you can't have this for 20 and then add another 20 and add another 50, right? Like years. I mean, there's definitely ethical issues, but even from an economic standpoint, it's not really just, I don't think. And so part of what will make the fourth industrial revolution a source of betterment for society, I think, is around a redemocratization also of technological innovation, right? So
what do you mean by that?
So like dispersing, right now we have huge concentrations in terms of who is doing the innovating, and who controls what technological innovations are occurring and how the profits from those are ultimately like funneled. So, I mean, I think for most people, what would be the clearest is, Google, Apple, Facebook, like these sort of tech companies are the ones we're most familiar with, but there's obviously a lot of other kind of tech companies, but they buy up in a second anybody who's even starting to potentially compete with them, right? And so they've established ostensibly monopolies within these industries in terms of the control of our information and our interconnection and the way that we're even relating to one another in this day and age, right? And that's too much power for any group of people to have, and that's what companies are ultimately. It's like, a group of people. Yeah. And so they shouldn't have that much power. And so it's important for us to allow for the information, the foundations, the innovations to be dispersed amongst many different companies, right? Or firms or initiatives, in order for the sort of fruits of that to be shared more equitably, I think, and more accountability for it as well.
When you think of additional opportunities that we could pursue with this fourth industrial revolution, like what would be your sort of top 3 or 5 that you feel like here's some things that we need to move towards, because so that we can really make the economy work for people?
I think one area is definitely around systems thinking. Mm-hmm. So I feel that we are in a moment where we are moving beyond linear, very structured thinking and embracing much more complex, emergent, messy, like systems, processes, like multi-dimensional, like all of that stuff. Yeah. And that is huge, right? Like it moves us beyond silos. It connects us across spaces. It engages the realities of the world, right? And I think there is huge benefits to technology's capacity to help us conceptualize, visualize, map some of these complexities and systems. I still don't think that you can ever make up for a human discussion on these things also, right? But I think it can help, especially when we're talking about a system which is global and includes so many people, allowing for avenues of direct input. So I don't know if you know about like the Dedisim Barcelona, but like globally right now we're seeing a lot of demands for greater, like a revitalization of democracy, honestly, right? And so that's happening at municipal levels, like national levels, regional levels. But in Barcelona, what they did after the financial crisis and a huge amount of public dissent, they created a platform where people could just propose their policy proposals, engage in a direct communication about them, vote on them with each other, all of this stuff, and they're automatically adopted by the city government, right? Like as, and so very direct democracy being able to come as a result of some of these technological innovations. And again, I mean, technology has always had the capacity to make our lives a lot easier. Yeah. Like for us to have more time, for us not to have to do like really difficult, physically difficult things. Yeah. And that stands. Yeah, it's just that I don't think we're really, it's about us really taking advantage of that and making it clear that the fruits of the technological innovations need to be shared with everyone. So all of that, I think we have the capacity to liberate the world, honestly, from,
When you talk about time, something that dawned on me was someone we had on the podcast, and he runs a charitable organization, and he said that he moved their organization to a 4-day work week, and he has some preliminary data to show how revenues have increased, engagement has increased, donations have increased, just all their barometers or metrics for success have improved. Staff engagement, mental health, well-being, all that stuff has increased. And so his pitch is that, like, if we're a small organization of 5 to 10 and we can make this with not much money, and he pays them, right, for the 5th day. Like, it's 4 days, but he pays them for 5 days. If they can do that, then a whole lot of other people can do that as well. So
absolutely. I mean, they made the argument, so during the Industrial Revolution, right, like, people were working all day, every day. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was no 5-day work week until you had the labor movement. And mm-hmm. with the move towards a 5-day work week, people were like, oh, we're going to lose so much output and productivity mm-hmm. and all of these things. And it wasn't true. Yeah, like, people can't work that much. Yeah, we can't focus for that long. We also, as an organization, recently moved to a 4-day work week. And for myself personally, like, it has been really, really beneficial for feeling more balanced and more, less exhausted. And because I think at the end of the day, all we can bring is ourselves to a scenario. And if we are exhausted and we're cranky and we're like, we're feeling like martyrs in the space, then it's not going to ripple very well. So the more we can, This is part of have you ever read David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs?
No.
So he died during COVID. Tragic. Okay. Not because of COVID, but one of the most brilliant modern minds, I think, in like new economic thinking. He wrote this book, and it highlighted that in the US and UK right now, the majority of people feel that they are working in a job that should not or need not exist. Yeah, so meaning they're doing work that is either not actually helpful to anything or is actively detrimental. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a huge problem.
That's a large.
Yeah, like that's a big problem, right? Like that many people are feeling that because a lot of our personal well-being, a lot of our identity, our connection, our meaning in life comes from feeling like we are going in service to others. Absolutely. In some way, right? Yeah. And the avenues by which to be in service to others are really low paid, relative to the ones that are super extractive and harmful to others, right? And so we just gotta like switch that. Yeah, like, I'm not saying we got to get rid of like all of the, like stock market traders or whatever, but they're not the most beneficial people to society. Yeah. And so I don't think that they should be paid, like 12,000 times more than a kindergarten teacher. Yeah. Like that's a really useful job to society. And so all of that is just incentives. Yeah. It's policies. It's collective decision making. So we have the capacity to determine what kind of innovations we want to see, what kind of economic behaviors we want to grow, kind of activities we want to flourish. And so
what would that ideal economic model be then to create that shift?
Well, I mean, so for me, honestly, I don't think it's about saying what is the ideal economic model because we need to build it. Yeah. Like this is about building it in our location, in our context. So I think it's problematic to think like this economic system we feel like is imposed upon us, that we're going to wait for the perfect one to be equally imposed, because the reality is that it's just about figuring out how we do want to produce and provide for one another, right? And to do it in a way that makes sense for our geography, our culture, our history, our politics, all of those things, taking it into account, and to do it in a way that engages as many voices as possible, I think is the major thing. So it can become a blueprint, right? It can become a blueprint for other places, or, you know, it becomes the model in and of itself for what
that sounds like, though, it would challenge sort of globalization, right? And the way the current economy works big time. And it's interesting because I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but with the pandemic, it seems that countries are realizing that the fact that, you know, Canada had this trouble of a lot of our PPE was being developed by other countries, and we didn't even have the manufacturing capacity. We relied on other states to provide us with that, and we caught ourselves in trouble. But it's sort of a very relevant and mainstream example, I guess, for how countries are recognizing that they need to develop things more locally. But that's really going to challenge sort of the global supply chain and the economy. But are you saying then that that's an okay thing, or how would you rectify that?
I mean, I do definitely think we should all be making more of our own shit. 100%. Yeah. Like, I think it's important for like having a dynamic, a resilient, like flourishing sort of economy. The reality is that we can't all produce all things, right? So I think it's also naive to feel like, you know, I'm going to be like, let's be a protectionist, like totally isolated country over here because, you know, I like mangoes. Yeah, like we don't grow mangoes here, right? There's a lot of things that other cultures and, you know, countries and things make that are amazing. The innovations that come from there, the medical, right? Like innovations. And I think those things can really be shared. But yeah, I mean, globalization, first of all, we are experiencing a backlash to it, but it's also important for us to think about globalization as a thing is not bad, right? Like if we had real globalization, it would just mean anything can move wherever it wants around the world. We are one humanity on one planet. Yay, right? The reality is that's not what our globalization has been, right? Like we allow for goods to move anywhere we want them to, but the people who make them aren't allowed to move, right? Like we allow for money to move like at thousands of like times around the world per second, but we don't allow for, you know, information, right? And like technology to be able to like move in that way. So we've really determined and built a very imbalanced form of globalization, and I think that's what we're dealing with now. Personally, I think we shouldn't have borders. I think everybody should be able to move wherever they want. Most people want to stay where they are anyways, or at least just go for a while somewhere else and experience it and come back. Like, yeah. So I'm worried about the ethno-nationalist backlash that's happening right now. I think it's important for us to make more of our own things and to relocalize our economies, but not at the expense of like racist, very like nationalist sentiments that I think are just going to breed war.
Absolutely. Yeah. I want to ask you a couple questions that I like to ask most of our guests. I think I might have sent them to you. So the first one is, if there are 5 people that you would want to have a meal with, supper, it could be collectively, it could be individually, who would those 5 people be for you?
Yeah, you did send this to me, but I don't think I've fully thought of everything. So definitely Kofi Annan.
Yep.
Arundhati Roy.
I don't know that person.
Oh, she's amazing. You'll love her. She's like a badass author from India who does a lot. Okay. She wrote some novels, but also writes a lot of like political advocacy stuff.
Okay.
It's very cool. Dalai Lama. Ida B. Wells. I always really liked her. One more. Yeah, it's tough. I don't know. I'll say.
Would you have these collective, or would you want them individually?
I mean, I think individual conversations are always nicest, right? Like you
Yeah.
can really build a connection, whereas trying to manage group conversations can be hard, but it'd be fascinating to witness their conversations. So I think if I had it as a group, I would just sit and be quiet and listen.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know?
Well, you're talking about some pretty big giants.
It's
It's like, what do you say in that, right? Just being a fly on the wall would be amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Besides the circle of life, what do you know for sure?
So the thing that I believe most strongly is that the purpose in life, my purpose in life, I guess, is to be happy and to be of service to others. And that I can't do one without the other.
Love it. Amanda, I really want to thank you. I really appreciate your time. I learned a lot. It in some regards, it felt like, a nerding out session at a in the lecture hall, but it was filled with, just sharing different aspects about life in Vermont. I really appreciated that background as well, and I think people will find it really really engaging. So I really appreciate that. We'll put all of Amanda's information in our show description, and I encourage you to watch this episode and follow WEAll and look into the work that they do. And I'm pretty sure we didn't get a chance to talk about this, but I believe that you led the development of a policy design guide.
Yeah.
Which I actually did look at it.
Yeah, did you like it?
Yeah, I did look at it.
We didn't get a chance to talk about that, but I mean, that's probably because of my background and just kind of nerding out about like that kind of stuff. But I don't know if the rest of everyone's really gonna want to hear about just all my thoughts on that for now. But Amanda's done some great work on that, so be sure to check that out. I'm pretty sure you did. I think there was a YouTube video that you guys had put out in terms of when you released it, and I watched part of that. So if you want to see Amanda's work, check that out as well. But Amanda, I just want to thank you for your time. Appreciate you again answering my email to begin with. It's a pleasure to sort of have you. Actually, you're our first international guest.
Oh, wow. Pleasure to talk to you as well. I'm sorry if it was a little bit rambly at any points. But it was really fun. I enjoyed it a lot.
Great. So yeah, look forward to having you guys join us on our next episode. Thanks, Amanda. See ya.